Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salamu ala Rasulih al-Kareem. We begin in the name of Allah, the Most Merciful, with recitation from the Noble Quran, for which I invite Qari Shamsul Huda.
ويتفكرون في خلق السماوات والأرض ربنا ما خلقت هذا باطلا سبحانك فقنا عذاب النار ربنا إنك من تدخل النار فقد أخزيته وما للظالمين من أنصار ربنا إننا سمعنا مناديا ينادي للإيمان أن آمنوا بربكم فآمنا ربنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار صدق الله العظيم.
On behalf of the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences, Berkeley, Islamic Research Institute of the International Islamic University, International Institute of Islamic Thought, I'd like to welcome you to this international conference on God, Life, and Cosmos, Theistic Perspectives. We are very lucky to have an exceptionally eloquent keynote speaker here today, Dr. William C. Chittock. Before I invite him to deliver his keynote address, I'd like to briefly introduce the conference to you with the hope that many of you would like to join us for the rest of the sessions which will be held in the Best Western Hotel. We are hoping that we will have one more honor of having Dr. Mahmood Ghazi here as our chief guest, but unfortunately he fell ill this morning. Nevertheless, we are very happy to have Dr. Hassan Al-Shafi, the president of International Islamic University, both as the chief guest as well as the president or chairman for this session. I begin to introduce the conference by asking you a few questions. How did the universe begin? How did the life begin? Is there a direction for the whole universe as well as for the human life? Well, as Muslims, we know the answers. We have known these answers for centuries from our religion. But in the 20th century, modern science has assumed the role of providing answers to these questions. Cosmology, neuroscience, bioengineering, all of these fields are claiming to provide us authentic answers which can be verified experimentally. As a result, science has started to claim a position which was held by religions throughout human history. Unfortunately, in the Muslim world, where there is so much demand for science and science and science, no one is looking at these very basic questions. There is not a single university in the Muslim world where one can go and study the relationship between science and religion. But in the West, where the scientific revolution produced fundamental changes in the worldviews of human beings, there is a lot of work being done between the relationship between sciences and religion. The purpose of this conference, well, one of the purposes of this conference is to find out different ways, different relationships between science and Islam on the one hand, and look at some of the answers which have been provided by the Christian religious scholarship about the relationship between Christianity and science. In a way, this is the third conference in Islamabad on the subject of Islam and science. But let me point out that this particular conference is different from the two conferences held in 1983 and 1995, in the sense that those conferences were primarily looking at the Muslim contributions to science. Glorious as their subject may be, let me also say in passing that it's a sad tragedy that what was once a living, vibrant intellectual tradition has turned into legacy. And we all take pride in saying that Ibn Sina contributed this and this and that to the sciences, but we don't realize that we are talking about a dead past. Islamic intellectual tradition has always maintained that it is possible for the human intellect to discover truth, haqq, unaided by revelation. Although revelation itself provides an answer, but the questions I asked you in the beginning were also the questions central to the Islamic intellectual tradition. Unfortunately, we don't have that tradition anymore. And it's our hope that through interaction, through bringing scholars together in conferences like this, we will be able to revive that Islamic intellectual tradition. We have 4 major themes in the conference. The first theme deals with the philosophical and historical perspectives on the relationship between science and Islam, or science and religion in general, because we do have 2 Christian scholars among us out of 5 who were coming originally, but 3 of them could not make it. The second major theme is cosmology. In the West, most of the discussion on cosmology has centered on physical cosmology. Fortunately, we have a very rich tradition in Islamic intellectual heritage, and I feel very sad when I say heritage, but nevertheless, that's the fact, of relating human intellect in different ways to the question of origins. The third major theme of the conference is causality and divine action. And finally, the last theme of the conference deals with neuroscience, genetics, and bioethics. I'm sure every one of you realize the great need for ijtihad in matters which have arisen out of research in modern science. If my kidney fails, I can have a new kidney transplanted. But what if that new kidney has been processing alcohol for the last 30 years? Is it halal for me or not? I leave you with this thought. I'm sure there are religious scholars here who would be able to provide answers to these questions. Now I have double pleasure in inviting Professor William C. Chittock, who teaches at the State University of New York, Stony Brook, who is probably known to all of you through his various works, especially The Vision of Islam, which is a very important book for Muslims as well as non-Muslims. And my double pleasure comes from the fact that about a year and a half ago, when I had not met him personally, I was in Tehran. Somebody was sitting on the stage in a conference on Mullah Sadra, who had a remarkable brilliance in his eyes, a nur that's very rare. And I looked at that person without realizing that that's William Chittock. Later when I realized, I went up to him and I said, it's so strange that I wasn't planning to come to this conference, but I saw you here. We are organizing, or we're thinking of organizing a conference in Pakistan, in Islamabad, 2 years or a year and a half from now. Would you come? He said, well, tentatively, yes. It turned out later, as I came to know him more intimately, and I heard him in July last year in Chicago, I realized that perhaps no one in the West would be the best person to give us the keynote address for the conference than him. He has done some remarkable fundamental basic research in Islamic cosmology through the works of Ibn al-Arabi. But more than that, it's the clarity of thought, it's the vision behind the words. That's the most attractive thing. So I'd like to request you to welcome Professor Chittock.
Thank you, Dr. Iqbal, for that very kind introduction. My purpose today is to suggest some of the issues that need to be raised from the side of Islamic thinking when we want to discuss religion and science. For religion, I want to keep in view the Islamic intellectual tradition, especially in the later stages of that tradition, when it achieved a synthetic view of many of the schools of Islamic learning. As for science, I want to look at it in two respects. First, science in the modern meaning of the word, and second, science is the designation for the tradition of Islamic learning that addressed issues having to do with the study of the natural world in something like the modern sense. In fact, it is precisely the just mentioned intellectual tradition that produced a number of great scholars who studied the natural world in what has often been called a scientific manner. In order to understand the nature of the scientific learning that was produced by the Islamic intellectual tradition, we need to situate the tradition in the broad context of Islamic learning as a whole. Now, the word intellectual, aqli, was given to this tradition partly to distinguish it from another tradition of learning that has been called transmitted, naqli. So we have aqli and naqli. It is important to grasp the difference between these two sorts of learning. Too often nowadays, Muslims discuss modern science while drawing exclusively from the transmitted learning and without having any awareness that great Muslim thinkers of the past carried out profound investigations into the nature of scientific knowledge. Now, in the Islamic tradition itself, speaking broadly, a clear distinction has always been drawn between transmitted and intellectual learning. Transmitted learning is knowledge that has been passed on from generation to generation. In contrast, intellectual learning cannot really be passed on, though it is easy enough to speak and to write about it, and especially about its history and its legacy. Intellectual learning must be recovered anew by each generation. Typical examples of transmitted learning are language, Quran, Hadith, all of which need to be accepted as they are. For example, nothing can be known about the Quran without the text. And once the text has been received, it cannot be changed, though it certainly can be interpreted in a variety of ways. Now, intellectual learning is of a different sort. The most common example is mathematics. Although mathematics is transmitted to us, we do not say 2 plus 2 equals 4 because my teacher said so. The human mind is able to discover and understand mathematical truth on its own. Books and teachers are there in order to help us understand for ourselves. Once the mind discovers the knowledge, it does not depend upon outside sources. The knowledge is accepted because it is true. It is known to be true because once it is understood, it is self-evident. In other words, once understood, it cannot be denied any more than one can deny one's own self-awareness. Now, the whole body of intellectual learning is understood, or has been understood, to be of the same sort as mathematics. It can only be discovered within oneself, which is to say that texts and teachers function to help the student develop the capacity to understand. Once students have actualized and realized intellectual knowledge within themselves, they have no need for texts and teachers. In theory, intellectual knowledge can be discovered by the mind working alone, so there's no need for transmission. In other words, human beings are sufficiently endowed by the nature of things to discover intellectual truth on their own. In practice, however, intellectual knowledge needs transmission in order to be grasped. Very few people can make any real progress toward intellectual understanding without the help of those who have already understood it. One of the most obvious examples of transmitted religious learning is knowledge of the Sharia, which provides the framework for Islamic praxis. Why, for example, why must Muslims perform the ritual prayer 5 times a day? Now, the only real answer to this question is because God said so. The mind cannot discover what God said without having heard the Quran and the prophetic reports, which have been transmitted from earlier generations. Once the transmitted learning is gained, it is still not clear why God said 5 and not 3 or 6. Any sort of explanation is after the fact. The explanation serves only to enhance the authority of the teaching and to make it easier to accept. In short, in transmitted religious learning, the basic proof of a statement's truth is God said so. In intellectual learning, The basic proof of the statement is that it goes back to self-evident truths. Now, in order to avoid possible misunderstandings, let me stress the fact that the two types of learning intermix in the human soul. The relationship is complementary, not antagonistic. Most of the Muslim intellectuals took it for granted that faith in the transmitted learning, along with practice of the transmitted rituals, were necessary aids to intellectual understanding. In some branches of the intellectual tradition, it was even held that faith in transmitted knowledge was indispensable for the full actualization of the human intellect. The best way to understand the difference between intellectual and transmitted learning may perhaps be in terms of the words taqlid and tahqiq. Taqlid, as you know, means imitation or following authority. It is the proper way to acquire transmitted knowledge. Tahqiq means verification or realization. It is the proper way to reach intellectual understanding. People learn language from their elders by imitation. They learn the Quran and proper Islamic activity by imitating the Prophet and his worthy followers. In contrast, the only possible way to master the intellectual sciences is by verification and realization. In other words, no one can know the truth of an intellectual issue without discovering it for himself in himself. You can learn a mathematical formula by rote, but until you understand it thoroughly and it becomes second nature to you, it is not yours. You are simply imitating others in your knowledge. Now, the Muslim intellectual tradition in general has maintained that it is necessary to imitate the Quran and the Prophet in transmitted issues. As for intellectual issues, although it is normal to accept such issues on authority from the great Muslims of the past, it is by no means sufficient. In this domain, in intellectual issues, imitation is only the first stage. The human intellect has the potential to know for itself without the intermediary of the transmitted learning. And it is the duty of those who have the capacity to understand intellectual issues to actualize that understanding for themselves, not simply to depend upon the views of others. In short, there are two basic kinds of knowledge, and each kind has a method proper to it. The method proper to transmitted learning is taqlid, or imitation. And the method proper to intellectual learning is tahqiq, or verification and realization. Now, someone who becomes a master of the discipline of fiqh, jurisprudence, which is one of the transmitted sciences, may reach the degree of ijtihad, but a mujtahid should not be confused with a muhaqqiq. That is one who has achieved tahqiq. Why? Because the knowledge of a mujtahid pertains to the interpretation of the Quran and the Hadith in matters having to do with the Sharia. And a mujtahid cannot acquire that knowledge without transmission of the revealed sources. By contrast, a muhaqqiq's knowledge pertains not to the legal sciences, but to the intellectual sciences. He knows what he knows because it has become self-evident for him, which is to say that his knowledge carries its own proof within the very act of understanding it. The knowledge does not depend for its truth on the Quran and the Hadith. Given that there are two different routes to knowledge, and given that imitation is proper to the transmitted sciences and verification to the intellectual sciences, it follows that when people learn intellectual knowledge that they have not verified for themselves, they do not in fact know what they think they know. They haven't verified it. This is called compound ignorance, jahl murakkab. In other words, they do not know the knowledge, and their ignorance is compounded by the fact that they do not know that they do not know. Now, compound ignorance has always been considered a blight on the human soul. Why? Because it closes the door to learning and understanding. If people think that they already know, why would they try to achieve understanding? The only way to cure compound ignorance is to wake up to one's ignorance. Then the ignorance will be simple rather than compound. The cure for simple ignorance is the search for knowledge. In short, if nothing else is remembered about the intellectual tradition, this should be kept in mind. The first goal of intellectual learning is tahqiq. And tahqiq is to know things by verifying and realizing their truth for oneself. One cannot verify the truth and reality of something without knowing it firsthand, for oneself, in one's own soul. If knowledge is simply the memorization of the views of the authorities or the experts, it is not verified knowledge. Rather, it is transmitted and imitative knowledge. Now, from what I have just said, it should be clear that the vast majority of people hold practically all of their opinions on the basis of transmitted knowledge, not intellectual knowledge. In other words, most people take their opinions from what they have learned in school, or read in books, or seen on television, or heard from people whom they respect. They have not verified their knowledge. No matter what they think they know, they do not know it for certain. Rather, they take it on the basis of belief in the authority of its source. Now, it should be clear that imitative knowledge, taqlid, may be derived from a variety of sources. It may come from a religious tradition, going back to a prophet like Moses or Jesus or Muhammad, or it may be derived from modern traditions of learning that have their own quasi-prophets. People like Darwin, Freud, Einstein. If one is to be sure that one has chosen the right authorities in one's imitation, taqlid, one certainly needs to ask about the validity and the truthfulness of the transmitted knowledge. Now, before continuing the discussion of the relation between the Islamic intellectual tradition and modern science, I need to say something about the word science itself. In the etymological sense, the word can refer to any sort of knowledge. But when it is contrasted with religion, we understand that it means the modern endeavor of scientists in fields like physics, biology, and geology. Science, in other words, is understood as an empirical knowledge that has been obtained through the scientific method. While acknowledging this meaning of the word science, we also need to keep in mind the fact of scientism. Scientism, as the physicist and social critic Rustam Roy would say, is to take science as your theology and technology as your day-to-day religion. Scientism is a way of looking at the world that gives to science the type of truth value that used to be given to revealed scriptures. Despite the fact that many modern-day philosophers, scientists, and writers have criticized scientism, it remains true that most people in the modern world, even educated people who should know better, take scientific knowledge as possessing a unique sort of reliability. Western popular culture, and today the same is largely true of Islamic popular culture, is based on a view of the universe, human life, and human destiny that accepts scientific theories as facts. Science is understood as providing the only reliable answers to questions about the world. In this view of things, the role of religion can at best be to supply belief systems and ritual practices, which in turn give people solace and contribute to social stability. Now, one result of scientism has been that the Islamic intellectual tradition has been totally eclipsed by science and the disciplines of the modern academy, such as philosophy, political science, and sociology. This means that contemporary Muslim thinkers have been trained in the modern disciplines and typically discuss science and religion in Western terms. Religion is given a small, if usually respected place in life, but the tradition of intellectual learning, if there is any awareness of it, is looked upon as the long-dead ancestor of modern science. An ancestor whose often fanciful teachings have now been displaced by facts. Now, in the context of Islam, the basis for thinking that religion does not concern itself with scientific questions is the notion that religion deals exclusively with the transmission of beliefs and practices. Transmitted learning, in other words. However, the moment we look at the Islamic intellectual tradition, we see that Islam has always embraced every sort of knowledge. What we call scientific knowledge was one form of learning that was included among the intellectual disciplines. But to understand the significance of this inclusion, we first must understand what Muslim intellectuals were trying to do. Now, if we want to understand the purposes and the goals of Muslim intellectuals, we need to remember that their methodology was tahqiq, verification and realization. Having remembered this, we can ask ourselves, what sorts of knowledge can be verified and realized? What were Muslim intellectuals trying to know by themselves and for themselves without depending upon any outside authority? What sorts of understanding did they think could not be supplied by the words of the prophets, the theologians, and the jurists? Note first that the purpose of the intellectual was not to gather information, or what we call facts. It was not to contribute to the progress of science, much less to build up a database. Rather, the purpose of the intellectual tradition was to refine human understanding. In other words, seekers of knowledge were trying to train their minds and polish their hearts so that they could understand everything that can properly be understood by the human mind, everything about which it is possible to have certain, sure, and verified knowledge. Each seeker of knowledge was expected to find his knowledge for himself. He was expected to know his subject with first-hand, unmediated knowledge. If he took the word of a teacher or a book, instead of realizing the truth for himself, he was an imitator. Imitation cannot provide intellectual knowledge, only transmitted knowledge. Now, generally speaking, 4 major areas were considered the proper domains of tahqiq, verification. We can call these, with modern terminology, metaphysics, cosmology, psychology, and ethics. Metaphysics is the study of the original and final reality that underlies all the phenomena of the universe. The topic of discussion is God, though God is often called by impersonal names such as existence, wujud, or the necessary, or the first. Cosmology is the study of the appearance and disappearance of the world. Where does the universe come from and where does it go? Naturally, it comes from the first and it goes back to the first. But how exactly does it get here? And how exactly does it return there? The intellectual tradition maintained that it was possible to verify the actual route of both the coming and the going. Psychology is the domain of the human soul, or the human self. What is a human being? Where do human beings come from, and where do they go? Why are people so different from each other? How can people develop the potentialities given to them by God, how can they become everything that they should and must become if they are to be fully human? Finally, ethics, the fourth domain, is the domain of practical wisdom. How does one train one's soul to obey the dictates of intelligence, follow the guidelines of God, and carry out one's everyday activities in harmony with God, the cosmos, and other human beings? What are the virtues of a healthy and wholesome soul? How can these virtues become the soul's second nature? It should be noted that the center of attention in all four domains of investigation was nafs, the human self, or the human soul. The human self is the key issue because only the self can come to know God and the cosmos. The way it does this is by developing and refining its own inner power, a power which is called intellect or heart. In order to develop this power, people need to know what sort of self, what sort of nafs they are dealing with. But you cannot know your own self by having the authorities or the experts tell you who you are. You do not reach knowledge of self from the outside, but from the inside. Until you know yourself from within, your self-knowledge will be based on imitation, not verification. It will not be intellectual knowledge, but rather transmitted knowledge. In the intellectual tradition, all knowledge, whether intellectual or transmitted, was considered an aid in the process of coming to know oneself. The fully aware soul is the soul that has become fully itself. In other words, through full consciousness of its own reality, the soul becomes fully conscious of what God created it to be. The philosophers frequently call such a soul al-aql bil-fi'l, the actualized intellect. This actualized intellect is the transformed and transmuted soul that has perfected both its theoretical and its practical powers. Having become such an intellect, the self lives in harmony with God, the universe, and other human beings. When the great masters of the intellectual tradition wrote about these four topics, they were writing about what they had verified, not simply what they had heard from someone else. They were highly critical of anyone who tried to understand these issues merely on the basis of transmission, imitation, or consensus. Intellectual questions demand intellectual answers. And the place to pose the questions and to understand the answers is the human soul itself. Now, it needs to be kept in mind that most people do not have the ability or the energy or the urge to refine their own souls and to strive to know themselves. It was generally agreed that such people should be satisfied with accepting and following transmitted knowledge. They should believe in the theological teachings and follow the practical instructions of the prophets. Faith, iman, was looked upon as a mode of participating passively in intellectual understanding. As a well-known saying of the prophet puts it, faith is a divine light that is thrown into the heart. It allows people to grasp intuitively what they do not understand in any articulate fashion. And it entails a firm commitment to its objects, which are primarily God, the Quran, the Prophet, and the day of resurrection. Now, from what I have said, it should be clear that the key to the Islamic intellectual tradition is precisely the intellect, aql. It was understood that the fully actualized intellect is achieved only by the prophets and those rare individuals who follow in their footsteps. This intellect is nothing but the soul that has come to know itself as it was created by God. In Quranic language, this is the God-given reality of human nature that is often called fitra, or innate disposition, original creation. This is the very self of Adam, to whom God taught all of the names. It is the primordial atom present in every human being. At root, this innate human disposition, this fitra, is good and wise because it inclines naturally toward Tawheed, which is the assertion of God's unity that stands at the heart of every prophetic revelation and forms the basis for acquiring true knowledge of all things. Now, the problem that people face with their own innate nature, their fitra, is that they are overcome by ignorance and forgetfulness. As long as the soul stays ignorant and forgetful of God, it cannot know itself, and it cannot properly be called an intellect. To the extent that people fail to actualize their innate disposition, they remain ignorant of who they are and of the nature of the cosmos. To the degree that they achieve the actualization of their original nature, they come to understand things in their principles or in their roots, their realities. In other words, they come to grasp the universe and the soul as these are related to God. They do not remain staring at surface phenomena and at appearances. In brief, the goal of the intellectual tradition was to help people come to know themselves so that they could achieve human perfection. To achieve perfection, one had to perfect the theoretical intellect, aql nazari, which is the human self that knows all the realities and all the names taught by God, and the practical intellect, aql amali, which is the human self that knows how to act correctly on the basis of true theoretical knowledge. From the perspective of the intellectual tradition, to know a thing truly is to know it in the context of the divine spirit that God blew into Adam after having molded his body of clay, a spirit that is also called the intellect. If we know things outside of the divine context, we do not in fact know them. If we think that we know them, we are afflicted by the disease of compound ignorance. The more confident we are about the truth of our knowledge, the more difficult it will be to cure our ignorance, or to cure the disease. Moreover, it should be obvious that any activity done on the basis of ignorance, not to mention compound ignorance, will lead to ill consequences, whether for the individual, society, or humanity itself. I repeat that. According to the masters of the intellectual tradition, no one can actualize intellectual knowledge by listening to others or by reading books. It cannot be learned by forming committees or by downloading it from the internet. It has to be found for oneself in oneself. Nonetheless, it remains necessary to listen to what the great teachers have said in order to understand the nature of the quest. When we do listen to the great teachers, we find that they agree on a large number of points, though they tend to use a great diversity of words and expressions to make the points. Mentioning a few of these points can help us grasp what exactly pre-modern Muslim intellectuals were trying to understand and were trying to verify. Let me list 10 of these points. The first point is Tawheed, the assertion of the unity of God. All Muslim intellectuals agreed on this, all the great ones at least. Tawheed means that all of reality is unified in its principle. In other words, everything in the universe comes from God and returns to God. Moreover, Tawheed is always in effect, which is to say that everything in the universe is utterly and absolutely dependent upon God, here and now, always and forever. Second, within the created order of reality, there is a permanent presence known as intellect, or spirit, or heart. And this permanent presence is the eternal light of God. All things are known to the intellect because it embraces globally the pattern in terms of which both the universe and human beings were created. Third, the universe is a grand hierarchy of levels in which every domain of reality is present simultaneously. This hierarchy is ordered in an intelligent way, according to the wisdom of God, and it begins and ends in intellect, which is the shining light of God. Fourth, the universe is divided into two basic realms, one visible and the other invisible. The invisible realm is the domain of spirit, light, intelligence, and awareness. The visible realm is the domain of body, darkness, ignorance, and unconsciousness. The invisible realm is closer to God and more real than the visible realm. The visible physical realm is the most amorphous, least intelligible, and least substantial of all real domains. Given that the physical realm, what is called matter nowadays, is relatively unreal, it has no control over the spiritual realm, just as created things have no control over God. This is not to deny, however, that the two realms, spiritual and physical, interact with each other in various ways. Fifth, human beings have a unique role to play in the cosmos. God created them in his own image, and he taught them his own names. He taught them all the names. Because of the innate human knowledge of the names, everything found in the external universe is also found, in essence and in reality, in the primordial human selfhood that is known as fitra. Sixth, the final goal of religion, and indeed of all human endeavor, is to awaken awareness and intellect in the heart. All human awareness of whatever sort is nothing but a glimmer of intellect, and there are infinite degrees of awakening. People are diverse in their aptitudes for finding the divine light within themselves. The prophetic teachings are addressed to all people and are meant to guide everyone to the divine light, if not in this world, then in the next. The intellectual tradition is designed to guide those who have the capacity to develop their self-awareness through verification and realization here and now. Seventh, ourselves are identical with our own awareness of things. We are what we know. The only way to achieve the fullness of our original innate disposition is to achieve the fullness of understanding. The more we understand, the more human we are. The more forgetful we are, the less human we are. The perfection of our humanity is not found in our individual uniqueness and our personal foibles, but in our shared fitra, created in the image of God, whose full realization can be called the actualized intellect. Eighth, the theoretical and practical intellects need to be developed in harmony. The role of the theoretical intellect is to know things as they truly are, and the role of the practical intellect is to guide human beings in proper activity and correct behavior. The two can only be developed on the model of fully actualized human beings, and the best example of such human beings are the prophets, Muhammad in particular. Without imitating the prophets on the level of transmitted learning, one cannot achieve perfection. Ninth, seekers of knowledge should spend as little time as possible on what is nowadays called the real world, because this world is in fact the least real of all cosmic domains. Seekers should busy themselves minimally with physical needs, and they should concentrate instead on training their souls in self-knowledge. Everything more than what is necessary to secure one's bodily welfare, a modicum of food, clothing, and shelter, is excessive and dangerous to human aspirations. 10th, the domain of mechanical contrivances, not to mention electronic devices, distracts people from their proper goals and can quickly become harmful to the soul. At its least harmful, this domain provides frivolous entertainment. At its most harmful, it can lead not only to catastrophe for the earth, but also to the desolation of human spirits. Now, I think I've said enough to suggest what sort of enterprise Muslim intellectuals were busy with for over 1,000 years. Let me now tell you, I'm going to change tack rather radically here. Let me tell you about a strange occurrence that happened to me back home as I was trying to decide how to bring home the significance of the intellectual tradition for those of us who live in modern times. I was sitting in my garden. I happen to live in Mount Sinai, New York. Some of you realize the significance of that. Gazing on the early August flowers. Muzaffar has seen my garden. It's nice. All at once, an old man appeared in the garden, in a place where there is no gate. And the man began walking toward me. I was surprised, to say the least. Then, however, I looked closely at his face, and I saw a luminosity that could not be mistaken. I immediately recognized that he had to be an apparition from what the intellectual tradition calls the world of imagination. Now, the old man came straight up to me, and he said in Arabic, "My name is Ibn Yaqzan, and I believe that I may be able to help you in your difficulty." Without giving me a chance to reply, he began speaking. Afterwards, I wondered at his name, Ibn Yaqzan, the son of the awake. Could this be the same Hay Ibn Yaqzan about whom Ibn Sina and Ibn Tufayl had written accounts? To be honest, I doubt it very much. But perhaps my Ibn Yaqzan was a family relative of sorts. In any case, let me give you the gist of what Ibn Yaqzan told me. He said that he had thoroughly surveyed the modern world and that he was truly astonished by what he had seen. Back in his times, when Islamic civilization was vibrantly alive, he had never imagined that things would come to this. Science and learning have clearly reached an incredible fever pitch. But what is truly astonishing is not the ready availability of an enormous amount of information. No. What is totally mind-boggling is the fact that people have no idea that all the information and learning is useless. It is completely irrelevant to the purpose of human life. People's understanding of their real situation has decreased in inverse proportion to the amount of information that they gather. The more facts people know, the less they understand about themselves and the world around them. Ibn Yaqzan told me that he was appalled at the loss of any sense of what knowledge is for. People think that they should gain knowledge so that they can control their social and natural surroundings and make their physical lives more comfortable. But he pointed out the quest for knowledge, talab al-ilm, that the Prophet made incumbent upon all believers is not a quest for information or for a better life. Rather, it is a quest to understand the Quran and the Hadith, and then on the basis of this understanding, it is a quest for self-knowledge, self-awareness, and the understandings of God's signs, ayat, in the universe and the soul. It is a search for wisdom and mastery of oneself, not for control and manipulation of the world and society. Ibn Yaqzan was struck by the misuse of words like scientist and intellectual. He saw that people use the word scientist to designate experts in knowledge that is supposed to be uniquely true and reliable. In fact, however, scientific knowledge is simply a means to understand appearances so that they can be manipulated to achieve the desires of human egos. He said that what people call science today is almost identical to what in his times they used to call sorcery. Certainly the goal of science and sorcery is exactly the same: to control God's creation for short-sighted and egotistic goals, if not for demonic ends, by recourse to means that escape ordinary human comprehension. Then there is the word intellectual. In his times, an intellectual was someone who knew God, the world, and the human soul on the basis of verification, not imitation. An intellectual was someone who claimed to know only what he had verified for himself. Otherwise, he admitted his ignorance or the fact that he was simply quoting someone else's opinion. In modern times, however, all those to whom the word intellectual is applied have received practically all their knowledge by imitation, not verification. They take what they call facts from others without verifying their truth. Then they build their own theories and practices on the basis of the facts, producing an endless proliferation of new theories and new facts that go back to no foundation in reality. The experts in the modern scientific and critical disciplines, whether or not they are considered intellectuals, do not know things as they are, but only in terms of the consensus of their colleagues, mathematical constructs, theoretical fantasies, and ideological presuppositions. Ibn Yaqzan saw that wherever imitation is necessary, that is, in following the transmitted learning that goes back to the prophets, people act as if they themselves know what is best for human happiness. In contrast, wherever verification and realization are necessary, people take everything by way of imitation. Instead of trying to verify what they would like to know about the world and themselves, they revel in compound ignorance. They blindly and obediently accept current opinions, which have been learned from the mass media and educational institutions. Whenever anyone says, scientists agree that, they believe that it must be the truth, because it is the consensus of the intellectual elite. The great scientists and technologists of the day are idolized as the heroes of popular imagination and the divine guides to a bright new age. Ibn Yaqzan was amazed at the blatant polytheism that drives mental and social endeavor. A God, after all, is that to which someone turns his hopes and aspirations. Tawheed, or the assertion of God's unity, is to acknowledge that there is only one proper object of aspiration. But Ibn Yaqzan saw that the modern world asserts a great multiplicity of gods. Of course, they're not called gods, because people consider themselves far beyond primitive superstition. Rather, the gods have respectable, scientific-sounding names, like, democracy, development, education, equality, evolution, health, management, modernization, planning, progress, standard of living, system, welfare. Whatever the gods may be called, and they have many, many names, they are sacred to modern society and worshipped everywhere. Ibn Yaqzan was astonished by the degree to which people, and especially Muslims, have lost sight of Tawheed. Instead of a worldview of Tawheed, he saw a worldview of takthir. Takthir is the opposite of Tawheed. Tawheed means literally to make one. Takthir means to make many. Tawheed is to declare unity by asserting the truth of the one, who is the absolute reality. It is to recognize the primacy and ultimacy of the unique reality that rules the universe. Tawheed is a way of seeing things that establishes correlation, balance, harmony, and coherence. In contrast, takthir is to declare the primacy of many gods and many goals. It is a way of seeing things that brings about dispersion, separation, partition, multiplicity, disconnected facts, incoherence, and confusion. It is the primary characteristic of the information age. Ibn Yaqzan quickly saw that all the technical, scientific, social, and political solutions that are offered to bring peace and harmony to the world simply intensify the reign of confusion. Along with the multiplicity of gods called by abstract, respectable names, Ibn Yaqzan saw ranks upon ranks of priests, serving the many gods, and encouraging their followers to immerse themselves in dispersion and confusion. He saw that each priesthood jealously guards its own private and empowering knowledge. He saw that the common people who Of course, Ibn Yaqzan came into the modern world from a tradition that has a dim view of priests in the first place. So he was not surprised to see that each contingent of priests contends with the other for a greater share of wealth, prestige, power, and social control. Nonetheless, he was surprised that people surrender their free will to the priests and think that they are following the path of enlightened and progressive knowledge. He was sure that no priest in the Middle Ages could have wanted a more subservient flock of sheep. Ibn Yaqzan was impressed by the engineering feats accomplished by the modern priests. He told me that some of these temples to the gods of Takfir, in their own strange way, are almost as impressive as the pyramids. But at least he could understand why the ancient Egyptians built monuments to gods who promised eternal life. What he could not understand was why modern people build temples to gods like medicine, technology, and scholarship, gods whose promises are constantly shown to be false. Moreover, he was utterly horrified by the unspeakable rituals that some of the priests perform in these great modern temples. As far as he knew, ancient peoples had never performed such bloodthirsty rituals. Especially shocking to him were the last rites, reserved for believers in the powers of the god medicine, rites that are carried out in chapels called intensive care units. To make a long story short, Ibn Yaqzan was appalled, not only by the situation of the common people, but also by the situation of the learned classes. In both cases, he saw that people have lost any sense of what is real. He was shocked by the way people immerse themselves in meaningless hopes and illusory endeavors. He was dismayed by the willful blindness to the permanent, everlasting, omnipresent reality that is called spirit, the intelligent and intelligible light of God. He was aghast at the loss of any sense of the hierarchical structure of the cosmos and the soul, at the flattening of the world that makes material appearance seem to be the only reality. He was astonished that people have surrendered their freedom to the private and esoteric knowledge of priests. He was amazed that a class known as intellectuals thinks that Tawheed and everything considered worthy of veneration and aspiration in past times were nothing but misguided delusions, self-serving fantasies, epiphenomena of psychological contingencies, and rationales for social injustice. Having taken a good look at the modern world, Ibn Yaqzan was anxious to go back to sanity. However, I told him that I could not report his diagnosis of the modern situation without some instruction from him as to how a cure might be accomplished. His first reaction was one of surprise. "Don't you know," he said, "that the cure is implicit in the diagnosis? If you have paid attention to what I have said, the road to good health is clear." Well, it was not clear to me. So I begged him to leave me with explicit instructions. He replied that anyone who does not have the wits to see that the cure is implicit in the diagnosis will not be helped by more explicit guidelines. Anyone who is simply looking for another priest to imitate or another belief system to follow does not have the necessary qualifications for intellectual understanding. I pleaded with him. Finally, he relented. "What?" he said. "I am afraid that anyone you speak to will be like Moses in his relation with Azhar. I tell you right now that practically no one will listen to advice because people are too immersed in the illusion of real life, brought about by intoxication with technology." Ibn Yaqzan then dictated to me a testament, and I've translated the testament as an appendix to this talk. In brief, he said that the goal of every seeker of knowledge must be to verify his own knowledge of things and to actualize the intellect within. The only hope for any society and any individual is to strive as best they can in the path of true and verified knowledge. There are three basic stages to the quest. The first stage is to purify the soul of compound ignorance and ugly character traits. The second stage is to learn true knowledge and to acquire beautiful character traits and virtues by way of imitating the prophets, the saints, and the sages. The third stage is to understand the truth of what has been learned by finding its principles in the very depths of the soul. This involves plumbing the depths of the human substance through rigorous training of the mind and intellect. To the extent that one achieves the goal, one will recover the original human substance, the radiance of the divine light. What surprised me most about Ibn Yaqzan's advice is that, despite having seen how the modern world works, he made no mention of government, group effort, solidarity, technology, or the internet. It seems that he saw all of these as veils that simply serve to increase the darkness of compound ignorance. They need to be peeled back and tossed away before one can begin the serious work of uncovering one's own original substance. Unless individuals can recover wisdom within their own selves, which are nothing but the radiance of the divine spirit, society can have no hope that wisdom will play a role in its governance. When wisdom is lost, the doors to true happiness will be shut. Ibn Yaqzan concluded his remarks by quoting this verse of the Quran. وَمَنْ يُسْلِمْ وَجْهَهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَهُوَ مُحْسِنٌ فَقَدْ اسْتَمْسَكَ بِالْعُرْوَةِ الْوُثْقَى وَإِلَى اللَّهِ عَاقِبَةُ الْأُمُورِ. He who submits his face to God while acting beautifully has seized hold of the firmest handle. And unto God is the outcome of all affairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chittock, for bringing this message to us from the word of the unseen. Now I invite Dr. Hassan Abdul Latif Al-Shafai, President of Islamic International University, Islamabad, for his presidential remarks.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين الصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين وبعد. I think I'm not the right person to comment on this very important, informative and profound presentation of the keynotes of this conference. The only thing I consider myself very lucky to participate, even I was not lucky enough to receive the paper in a good time to do justice to the position I have been put now. The only thing that, as Dr. Sahib mentioned, that one should develop his human faculties and try to realize as much as possible what has been given to him in his intellectual capacity. So I may just, after thanking him, to accept our humble invitation and to perform very effectively, beautifully, and I believe very helpful to those who will exercise reflection and debate during the whole conference period. I may, after that, just try to put also some questions to him. I think it may be important to him and to us, some of us, that this main classification or division of knowledge, the two sources of knowledge, two kinds of knowledge, and these main definitions of science, religion, scientism, the aqli and naqli, or as he put it, I think more correct than usual. Usually say rational and traditional knowledge. I think he selected a more exact terminology, saying intellectual and transmitted. And he tried to draw or to explain exactly the difference or the main differences in between the two kinds of knowledge, using the normal example or illustration of mathematics. It occurred already to me after reading the first few pages before coming that I may try to ask, and I think he will welcome and elaborate, develop the theme more vigorously, with satisfying some curiosity of a layman like me. I know some little things about theology, but I cannot talk about the topic in integration is dealing with religion and science and all this. Even he helped us, that he brought the solution or the basis of solution to the end of his very important lecture on the tongue of Hayy ibn Yaqzan, our man who came from the east, from your area, to the Muslim Spain. And then we have seen him in New York, coming to Dr. Sahib, telling him about the solution or the evaluation of the situation in the modern world. So, as people of somehow related to Hayy ibn Yaqzan, we may try to put before this very sharp mind, intellect of our guest today. What about the ijtihad, fiqhi ijtihad? To exercise fiqhi ijtihad. Ijtihad in the jurisprudence. Ijtihad which is not based on qiyas, analogy. Because this, all of us know, that needs some asl, some transmitted, as you put it, case, all the case, and we relate the new situation to it. But what about to understand in yourself, by yourself, for yourself, the purposes of Sharia, the maqasid of Sharia, the ijtihad based on maslahah. And then you'll draw knowledge. How would you going to call this knowledge? This knowledge. Naqli or aqli? intellectual or transmitted. It may be transmitted for the one who is going to imitate the mujtahid, but for mujtahid himself. And I may mention in this context, just for the sake of reflection, and I think I'm trying to think our guest in the proper way. I think he would prefer just to elaborate and mention some related topic or difficulties may arise in mind in someone like me. But for mujtahid himself, he is not allowed even to follow another mujtahid, because the knowledge of him in such a case is personal knowledge. It is knowledge obtained, acquired in himself, by himself, for himself. For someone else to follow him, it is another situation. It is imitation. What about ilm al-kalam? Even the old people said that Islamic theology or ilm al-kalam is sometimes to be considered naqli and sometimes to be considered aqli. Even most of them are seen, it is one branch of ulum aqliya. On what basis? Up to this new clear distinction in between naqli and aqli. I may mention some more. I'm sorry if I am boring you with these things, but I'm trying to help contributing to the great opening of gates for us to think and reflect. What about the distinction, all distinction between tawfiqi and tawqifi? Tawfiqi is the aqli or intellectual, as you have put it. Tawqifi, when you are receiving knowledge from the others. But within the fiqh knowledge, we find something which is tawfiqi, something which is tawqifi. Sometimes we find something which is ta'abbudi, just to be followed, received from divine. But sometimes we find other knowledge which is mu'allal, which has illah, have illah. What is it? Is it intellectual or transmitted? Also, even outside of ilm al-kalam and fiqh, we find diraya and riwaya. Riwaya, of course, is transmission. But what about diraya? Diraya means not only to understand. Of course, you will understand even the text through your own human faculties. But you can build upon it. And then you are adding something else, which is not actually transmitted. For someone like me, a bit traditional, I face some difficulties. I need some help from you or from Hayy ibn Yaqzan. I'm not having the ability to see him. And alhamdulillah, fortunately, you are able to. Let me also mention something else. Because you have mentioned in your very good paper, I'm not actually trying to praise you, and I know this is cheap way of evaluating the good presentation we had today. You indicated that some people may receive and should receive in the advice of some Gnostics like Ibn Arabi. I think you have mentioned that somewhere. With just acceptance or imitation for the time being. Even for him, for Ibn Arabi, if I know some little thing, it is better to accept without knowing the reason or the rationale. But this is the first stage, which leads to another thing. When he reaches the other things, or the other stages, what is it? Is it imitation? Is it transmitted knowledge? Or something else, which coming through intuition, coming through even through حي بن يقظان. And the stages of knowledge for Ibn Arabi and the other Muslim Sufis pass through three stages. The first is علم اليقين. And علم اليقين can be transmitted and can be intellectual. Just to listen to my voice outside, and you know this man is fulan. It is علم يقين, if you have no doubt. But to come and see me talking, there is no doubt. It is another stage of yaqeen, which aynul yaqeen. You have seen and listened. And you may question me, ask me, interact with me, communicate with me. It is another stage, which is haqqul yaqeen, or near to. I am giving ordinary example, not their own examples of Sufism. This kind of knowledge, where do we put it? Up to this distinction. The main submission here today is the two kinds of knowledge in order to relate the scientific knowledge as such up to our modern understanding or terminology should be related to intellectual and should be verified. And the methodology is the main thing, either imitation or verification, tahqiq. But, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah, he is saying that Quran is two things, to make also the things short: masail and dalail. He is giving the ideas or the beliefs or the injunctions, but at the same time, always he is giving the burhan, the proof, the dalil. And he himself admitting, saying, most of our people will take the Quranic masail and ignore its dalail. If you'll take Quran, it's the masail and dalail. Now you are taking things, understand things in yourself, by yourself, for yourself. You share the burhan. It doesn't matter that this burhan or proof came to you through some text, came to you through some philosophers, some scientists, but the actual fact that you share, understood, accepted, where we put this kind of knowledge, transmitted or intellectual. I think I should not confuse the good and clear and powerful presentation of Dr. Sahib with my just humble talk. But I'll further say, I was a student of Ilm al-Kalam and philosophy, Islamic philosophy, traditional philosophy. I think the presentation is the most powerful defense of the philosophy or intellectual knowledge I ever hear. But is it only this or some sort of better way to Irfan? As I have mentioned, علم اليقين, عين اليقين, and حق اليقين. You indicated at the beginning to this aspect of this issue, but it may, due to my unluckiness, that I could not grasp the whole presentation quite deeply. I think people that like the chief guest today, who inaugurated, can have something to say about the main issue in between science and religion. But let me ask also our guest another question. What about Iman al-Muqallid? They have differ over the same. Is it to be recognized as real Iman? Of course, to me, you did answer, but we need some more clearer answer. At the stage of imitation, and if he will be lucky enough to develop his Iman, either through the divine light to be thrown in his heart. You have mentioned that. But this is something up to the divine mercy. But is not for everyone. Imam Ghazali traveled a long journey to get the same. He could not find any kind of ilm yaqeen or certainty or this kind of personal knowledge, intellectual knowledge, in yourself, by yourself, for yourself. But he mentioned that it was only the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which has been thrown in my heart. I think he was trying to be humble, but even this divine light is not to be given to everyone unless, as Dr. Sahib said, he will develop his faculties, intellect, soul, and spirit to the extent that he may be ready to receive such a light. But what about Iman al-Muqallid in the two stages, before this or after this? I hope that we'll learn from our guest, that this mechanical life, empty of reflection, thinking, acceptance of what we know that it is reality, which make us, as he said, actual human beings. Now, I'm once again to thank our guest, and I think he could find myself and so many others, people to learn from him, listen to him, not to imitate only, but to try to share in the same ideas through the same methodology he explained. And we are very grateful to you, all of you, to come to us and to participate in this gathering. And we hope that inshallah in the coming days and sessions of this international conference about a very important theme, God, life, and cosmos, will find through your own contribution, question, and all the kind of participation, inshallah, will develop this theme and give something useful to our people here and to all who are waiting for the results. Thank you very much. Once again, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.